Hey, everybody, it's Global Politics with Jim Martin. And today I want to talk about NATO. There's been some talk amongst Trump and Trump administration would-be appointees about the necessity of NATO. Specifically, Trump has said that he wants European countries to pay for a lot more of their collective defense. In other cases, has talked about getting the United States out of NATO altogether. And I thought it would be useful to, go back and think about what the purpose of NATO was, some of that history, and to consider what might happen should the United States dramatically pull back from the NATO alliance or leave it altogether. The history of Europe pre-World War I was essentially a tale of huge cataclysmic wars between a variety of powers over many centuries. Seemingly about every 30 or 40 years, there'd be some sort of gigantic conflict. And in fact, when the United States was a backwater that nobody cared about, many Americans looked at Europe like a disaster area of a place to escape from because of all of the conflict and constant fighting. The First World War was really particularly cataclysmic. For instance, the French lost about 70% of males aged 18 to 36. Devastating conflict on a range of levels, and no one emerged unscathed from that. Having not really learned their lesson, they decided to have another one. That one was even more catastrophic for every country in Europe and many neighboring countries like Russia. Many war dead from the United States. Europe was almost completely destroyed in the wake of World War II. Rapidly, the Russians consolidated their hold over Eastern Europe and installed governments friendly to them and began. The Russian way of war is that you go into places, you take them, you steal everything of value, and you return it back to Russia, and then you subjugate that population. And that's what they did. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the United States was last man standing in many ways. The British Empire was bankrupted by World War II. France, again, was devastated. Every country there's extreme poverty, starvation, all sorts of things, and no real economies upon which to rebuild, creating an environment ripe with the potential for revolutions and these sorts of things. The United States passed the Marshall Plan, yes, and rebuilt most of Europe. And in that period of time, it became clear that the Soviet Union and the United States were the major powers. Each of them created their own alliance structures. Russia created the Warsaw Pact, and the United States and Great Britain, France, and some other countries created the NATO alliance. From the jump, the NATO alliance was designed to provide collective security, to defend against a potential Russian attack. The idea being behind NATO that the collective security of all of those countries together with the United States and Canada would ward off the potential or give the Russians pause for any potential westward expansion. What the purpose of NATO was to provide that collective security, but also it was to unify the response of every country within it. Now, if you cast back and think about the previous histories of Europe, and the wars, which were started by a variety of powers, just depended on which century you're in, by creating this overarching security structure under the United States, it was also designed to prevent that kind of general European war that had happened so many times in the last many centuries. Under that framework, of course, the United States gained trade access to all of these markets and did very, very well from that, as did all of those countries who were rebuilt, created their own economies, and essentially almost remade the cultures of many of these countries in some ways. I say almost. Considerably gave them a huge leg up in coming back from that devastating war. When the Soviet Union fell apart in the late 80s, early 90s, many people questioned, do we need this anymore? And interestingly enough, George Herbert Walker Bush, he was, of course, president at the time, but he had a long career, director of the CIA, an ambassador to China. He knew the people, he knew the players. He had been there and done that. And he advocated for a NATO that would become even larger and perhaps even accept Russia as a member and other states to provide sort of a collective security for large swaths of the world and to be a more positive force and help out in different conflicts around the world to keep things so that global trade could continue to increase. That was the general idea. We had a little spat of recession there for a minute, and it appeared during the campaign that George Herbert Walker Bush was a little bit out of touch with that. And so he was defeated. Bill Clinton came in. However, NATO remained a constant force through the 90s, though the leaders of many European countries kind of questioned, why are we still doing this? And their contributions to those declined a bit while their populations also dropped, rendering budgets a little bit more difficult to balance for them. However, NATO remained a thing. Nobody really questioned that it was going to continue to exist. I can remember, though, President Barack Obama asking for, as many presidents had, hey, let's all try to meet our 2% of GDP, kind of defense figures so that the United States isn't paying for all these things. It's important to consider that in the context of the size of European populations and economies. The EU as a whole is a great big economy, right? Germany, big economy, powerful economy. United Kingdom, France, Italy even. Populations, though, of each individual country range from a few million people in many cases to countries like Austria and Hungary with about 10 million. Norway, again, 5 million people. The economies and how they do things and how that all works in terms of military spending is much different than how a advanced, huge industrialized economy like the United States would. When Donald Trump was elected, he began to immediately call into question the existence of NATO and making veiled threats about withdrawing from it, withdrawing from some of these NATO agreements of various sorts that were kind of on the fringes of stuff. Since he has been out of office for the last 4 years, has continued to beat that drum. And it's not really surprising given that he is an isolationist and that most of the people that surround him are isolationists. They view things in transactional ways. They don't necessarily really understand the history of all of this and see things through a lens of its utility to them and to the United States solely. Now, you can question whether that's the right way to approach these things or not. However, it certainly seems like the Russian attack on Ukraine brings it into a quite direct focus. At any rate, Donald Trump has really questioned all of those sorts of things. And it seems likely that he would deprioritize NATO participation at best and probably would withdraw from it entirely. Now, what would happen if that were to occur? I wouldn't be so worried about a Russian attack at this point into, say, Poland or the Baltic states or things like that, because the war in Ukraine has been such a disastrous, bloody fight for them. They've lost about 1 million wounded and killed. And much of their modern vehicles in the Russian army and air force have been destroyed. They're using old equipment, very little new stuff. They don't have the industrial capacity to really do anything about that. However, we need to again think, if the kind of cap of American influence were to be removed from Europe, could it revert back to its natural history? People of the past were just like us, and they had many of the same motivations, many of the same philosophies and thinking, and were just as intelligent as us. They just didn't have the technology yet. The idea that they could revert back to those kinds of power relationships, it wouldn't be a surprise to me in one bit. Also, these countries have long historical memories, trauma that has been passed down through these generations of people. And they remember things like, many of you may be familiar with a slice of Germany that was cut off and turned into a Russian enclave, and it's called Kaliningrad. It's between Lithuania and Poland and Belarus. Kaliningrad is a Russian enclave. They have troops there. They base planes there. They probably have nuclear weapons there. It's hard to say. They certainly have long-range air defenses there. Poland could take that in a day or two. It's not that big. And Poland has a modern, sophisticated army and some naval forces and an air force, and they certainly could do that. It's within their power to do it. Another situation which could arise, in 1940, Russia at the time was allied with Germany. Weird history there, but it happened. Russia attacked Finland. And although Finland was masterful in its defense, it ended up giving up a chunk of territory, which is about the size of, maybe Connecticut, to Russia in exchange for a peace agreement. The memories of that resonate through Finnish history. People know about these things. And if they were to think, hey, Russia's on their back foot right now, maybe we might want to take that back. Would it be a shock? Not to me. Finland has a more than capable army and has been very active for decades in ensuring that they could defend themselves, because up until recently, they were neutral. They've cooperated with NATO for about 10 or 15 years, but prior to that, they were entirely neutral. And so they knew that they needed to be able to defend themselves. And so they had provided for that in their own budgets. If NATO was to be diminished, do you think that they would believe us when we would say that we would protect them under a nuclear umbrella, which is what's in Project 2025? It says that NATO would be almost completely dissolved from an American standpoint, except that we would provide a nuclear umbrella, meaning that if anyone was to invade or use nuclear weapons, that we would respond and defend Europe from that. If you don't have any kind of bases there or any troops or anything like that, how much of a promise is that? If you face the threat of nuclear war, if you were to get involved and not face the threat of nuclear war, if you didn't, would a Trump administration step back from that? Would a future administration say, hey, that's not our problem? I would say that is a significant threat. And even if it's a minor possibility, the threat is existential enough that you could see several NATO countries begin to shift their economies to a much more robust level of military spending than they ever have post-World War II. And furthermore, several of those countries would almost certainly develop nuclear weapons and could in very short order. And I talked about that in a couple of other videos. The idea of that is and should be extremely concerning to everyone. I realize that the outlay of gigantic military budgets to cover a NATO alliance is considerable. But I would also argue that at best case, like let's say that the United States gives up on Ukraine, Russia takes the rest of it and is sitting on the border of Poland. If NATO is still a thing, then we would have to reinvest, just as we did in the Cold War, to have permanent, large-scale basing in a variety of countries in Europe. We have bases there still. We have troops there. We have things. It pales in comparison to what that situation was like in the 50s and 60s and even 70s and 80s. It goes without saying that you would have to reconstitute something like that, and it would be very expensive. Next, if we were to withdraw and you saw these countries shift their economies back into more of a robust war footing, which they almost certainly would do, that means that they don't have the money to buy stuff from us. We wouldn't be able to import things from them. That would be damaging to our economy as well. The non-trivial threat under those scenarios of a general European war, the threat of that kind of war, even if it was entirely conventional, would be absolutely devastating for all of the countries and peoples that are there, but also for world trade and specifically for the United States, because we trade a lot with Europe. This would be incredibly damaging and would probably necessitate us to do the exact same thing we did in World War I and World War II, which would be to intervene. This is not something that would happen tomorrow or a month from now or 6 months from now, but could it happen in 3 years? Sure. Could it happen in 5 years? Yes. Thinking in a more worldwide sense, if you are to withdraw from NATO, what does that say about your security guarantees to other countries like Japan, South Korea, which in Project 2025, again, they make the same statements. Withdraw of military forces, make everybody there pay for their own stuff. We'll provide a nuclear umbrella. If that were to happen, might China decide that this is the moment to take Taiwan? Even with the hostility that many Republicans and Donald Trump have shown towards China, do they really want to get into a war with China over Taiwan? I don't know. Increasing the risk of it without an adequate system of alliances to check that, to know that you could go there and have allies like Australia, like South Korea, like Japan, to help you defend some of those areas, would seem to be incredibly foolhardy to me. These are all the sorts of bad possibilities that emerge from a withdrawal from NATO, which I think, given what I've read, what I know of the people that are orbiting around the potential new administration, is quite likely. With that, I welcome any of your questions or thoughts in the comments. If you like this material, please subscribe. It really helps me out. I look forward to visiting with all of you again soon. Thank you.